Hello, I'm Laura Ferrier, an agronomist with Grain Farmers Ontario. This GrainTALK webinar is focused on road safety, and I'm pleased to welcome Dean Anderson from Workplace Safety and Prevention Services. Dean Anderson is the Strategic Advisor, Agricultural Initiative for Workplace Safety and Prevention Services. Dean received his Bachelor of Science in Agriculture from the University of Guelph. He has years of experience conducting research in project management and crop production. Dean has worked with the major crops in the agricultural regions of Eastern and Western Canada and the United States. Dean has been working in agriculture, occupational health and safety for over 20 years and is currently the Strategic Advisor for Agriculture Initiatives at WSPS. Dean, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. I need to shorten that at some point in time. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you today. I'm going to relatively quickly cover off some of the major issues with farm equipment on the roadways. Our timeline today is not really enough time to do it full justice, but I will cover off topics that I think and hope are of interest to you. So for those of you who don't know who Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, just a quick little note. We are a not-for-profit organization and we work specifically in Ontario, although we do some national work, primarily in our other sectors we service. We do agriculture, manufacturing, and service sectors. And specifically, if you remember the old Farm Safety Association, that's the agricultural component of this. About 10 years ago, we amalgamated it with two other organizations. We currently manage education and awareness for about 167,000 firms in the province, which is about 4.1 million workers. Our area of expertise is occupational health and safety. We do consulting, training, and we have several other resources. We're full service. We have hygienists, ergonomists. We even have engineers on staff. So we can just about do anything if anyone needs it done. So it's enough selling for me. Today's agenda, as I said, I've got about 5 topics on here, so it's going to be a relatively quick discussion. But I will welcome any questions at the end if anyone has any, and certainly will chase down answers if people need to. I'm going to touch on the Highway Traffic Act specifically, and primarily discussing the rules and the exemptions according to farm equipment on the roadways. Discussion quickly around length, width, weight, those often come up. Sharing the road, how much of the road should you cover? Slow-moving vehicles always comes up. Lighting, and the issue of riders. I have also added at the end of this 2 short slides just on ATVs on the roads for people. So without any delay, I'll just jump into my first topic. The first one is farm equipment on the road. Under the Highway Traffic Act, we do have in the sector a number of exemptions, but we have rules we must adhere to. Such things like your standard stop signs, traffic signals, speed limits, which again becomes specific with slow-moving vehicles, yielding the right-of-way, yielding half of the road, oncoming and following traffic, using your turn signals, headlights, taillights, such things like impaired driving, and even distracted driving, using your cell phone, for example, in your hands, texting someone, playing around with a bunch of your GPS stuff, and swerving a little bit could be enough for a policeman to pull you over, and he's going to call you distracted. The rules of the road that don't apply, the specific ones to agriculture are you can't be charged for driving too slow on the road. You are designated a slow-moving vehicle. Driving on the shoulder doesn't apply. You can actually drive on the shoulder. Brakes on towed implements are not required. On other vehicles with towed equipment that's over a certain weight, you do have to require braking, and mandatory seatbelt use. Older tractors, for example, never had a seatbelt, so it does come under that exemption. Exemptions under the Highway Traffic Act, I've covered them off. This is a bit more why. Relative to any other business sector, there's more farm-related exemptions than anyone else in the Highway Traffic Act. This is historic, and some people may raise the issue, well, why don't we change some of the rules for farm equipment? I do suggest you be careful in your wishes because they will open the entire Highway Traffic Act up and look at all exemptions for farm equipment, for example, when they open that up. I talk about exemptions in here, but remember that doesn't mean you've got permission. It doesn't ignore also the ethics of being responsible for other people on the road. The question of legality versus common sense versus public responsibility always comes up on this. So, you can say I was perfectly in my right, but was it what you should have been doing? And that often comes up with something like, I'm not required to do a safety. Absolutely. But should you be taking an unsafe vehicle on the road, knowing that you might not be able to stop if, for example, someone pulls in front of you? They would then question you on the road on the safety of the vehicle and whether you were operating it in a safe manner. There are things that still could be charged, and there's always civil liability that pops up also. I hear a lot of those in that occur with farm equipment, and the trouble with them is they often start quoting the values in millions of dollars, not in hundreds of dollar fines. So think of that whenever you're entering onto the road. It's about being smart rather than right. So if you start asking me great questions and I start going, do you think that's the best way to operate in the road? You maybe need to start thinking twice. So farm equipment is one of those big exemptions for our equipment on the roadways. There are no length, width, even height, or weight restrictions on farm equipment on the roadway. We are often limited by height because of the height of where hydro wires are hung from. So knowing that going over 14 feet can often be a problem, especially in rural areas. You pull down the hydro wire and you're responsible to fix it. So there is nothing that says you can't be taller, but if you don't lower, say, an auger and you're driving down the road and it hits something, that's your fault. It's not the fault of the highway traffic builders. Farm equipment gets away with these exemptions, but you have to also remember that if you ever do damage to a road, for example, for being too heavy, and crossing a bridge, you take out guardrails, you take out signs along the side of the road, any of that kind of damage you can be found liable for. So you can't just drive down the road knocking down whatever you want to because the law doesn't say you've got a width restriction. Wide farm equipment must, and that's a MUST, that means thou shall, in the Highway Traffic Act, always keep to the right of the center line and in being able to allow other vehicles half of the road to pass you. And that goes for oncoming traffic and traffic following you. You can travel over the center line. As long as when you have oncoming traffic or traffic that's following you that wants to pass, you can pull over enough that they can get by you. So just doing it because your combine can cover the entire width of the road is fine. But technically, if an oncoming vehicle comes towards you, you must yield their lane to them. So you should keep all the way to the right when you're being overtaken. And obviously don't let anyone overtake you on the right-hand side. You should protect that as a driver always. Keep the right of the center line when approaching the crest of the hill, a curve, a bridge, or a tunnel. And that's when your view is obstructed. If you obviously a car hits you coming over a hill and you're over the center line, they would have had no way to know you were there, and you would be at fault being over the center line. And the other one is within the width of a railway crossing. It's the same idea. So those are times when the center line must absolutely be yielded, but the rest of the time you can cross the center line, but you have to yield. The length exemptions, there's sort of a re-quote at the top. If people want to, then go to the highway traffic and read it. It's a fun reading. There are no maximum numbers of wagons you can pull behind a tractor. There's nothing in the act that says you can only have 2 grain buggies behind your tractor. But you must be able to control them. You must be able to keep them in your lane. You must be able to stop them. And also you must be able to hold that weight if you're on a hill. So although it doesn't say what your weight has to be, you have to be able to maintain control. If you lose control at some point in time, the exemption isn't going to protect you. Always drive on the traveled portion of the road. That is the recommendation in the Highway Traffic Act. It's technically not legal to drive on the shoulder with a car just traveling down the road. Farm equipment is exempt from that, and they can drive on the shoulder. However, it often leads to difficulties. For example, the shoulder may not support your weight, or there are irregularities such as bumps and potholes and things like that, especially with, say, an articulating tractor, that can easily put the tractor out of control. So we would always say, much like a bicyclist, take your lane, drive in the lane. You're a vehicle on the road and you're perfectly allowed to drive in your lane. It's blocking traffic from passing you and blocking traffic that's oncoming from getting by you is the big issue with width. Where to drive farm equipment. You should always ask yourself, can I pull it safely? Can I control it if I need to? Can you come to a stop quickly when you need to? Do you have control of the trailing vehicle? Can I stop it if I need to? So are your brakes fit enough to be able to do that? And that would be whether you're using a tractor or a truck to pull something. And can you hold it? So if you're on a hill, if the brakes aren't going to hold and you're going to slowly slip back on a vehicle behind you, that's your fault as a operator of the equipment not having it done. And by weight, people often say, well, I can tow 4 grain buggies behind my tractor. Yes, it's a vehicle of traction. However, the general rule of thumb for any engineer would be the vehicle you're towing shouldn't be more than about 1.5 times the capacity of the vehicle in front to be able to stop it or slow it, which in most cases means 1 grain buggy is perfectly fine, 2 you're probably pushing it. The other thing to remember, and I'll cover it a bit later, but you also need to make sure that your levels of connections, so your chains for double connecting to the tractor, have to be able to hold all the weight of the vehicles that you're pulling behind you. So that if you start to add 3 grain buggies on behind, how fast is that chain going to snap if the drop pin pops out? And again, you would lose complete control, and that wouldn't be very good in that situation. So remember, any towed vehicle, you have to have 2 connections. So for the example, it generally is, think of a trailer, the pin or the hitch, and chains. And the chains have to be strong enough to hold the weight, and that's the weight of everything behind. It's also the pin and the drawbar, the whole connection. Often grain wagons are not made to take the weight of 3 grain wagons behind them. They're meant to hold the weight of the wagon that's there. The reason that they allow multiple hookups is so you can pull empty wagons back to the field, is what the engineers at the manufacturers would tell me. Don't use homemade pins. Make sure you're using pins that are stamped and certified with the weight. What happens often when things are moving back and forth, they slowly fatigue and all of a sudden the pin will snap. And the other thing it should have is a pin in the bottom to keep the pin from jumping out some reason. So it needs to be in good connection. The only case where this might seem different would be with 3-point hitch vehicles, but technically they have 3 points of attachment, so that they actually do meet the 2 points of attachment. And always make sure you're inspecting your pins. If they're damaged or whatever, make sure you're replacing them. And every once in a while, drawbars tend to get worn. You might want to replace them so the pins don't have as much slack in them. That jamming back and forth will shorten the life of a pin quite quickly. Remember that you are also responsible for the load being attached. No portion of a load can actually become dislodged, fall, leak, spill, blow. And weight restrictions also don't cover off that that fluffy material hanging out over the side. So you need to make sure that your load is on and is secure. And if your load ever comes unattached, and you never even did do anything to hold the load in place, I'm quite sure that when the police come to investigate the incident, you're going to probably get ticketed for not having your load secured. Slow-moving vehicle signs. This one here, I could probably end up talking all day. I could probably also end up answering questions all day. What the Highway Traffic Act actually says is an SMV shall be attached to all slow-moving vehicles. And a tractor is, by definition, a slow-moving vehicle. Also, so are self-propelled vehicles of husbandry. I'll just quickly go a combine. They are, by definition, a slow-moving vehicle. So they have to have an SMV sign on the back. They also, although they might be capable of, they should not travel on the road at more than 40 kilometers an hour, or they are speeding. It doesn't matter what the speed limit is on the road, unless it's less than 40. We don't have a lot of those in Ontario. But traveling over 40 kilometers an hour with a farm vehicle is technically speeding. Motor vehicles towing farm equipment also have to have an SMV sign on the very back. So I then asked that question: if you're pulling 3 grain wagons in a row, we'll just say they're empty, do I have to have an SMV sign on them all? No, it needs to be on the most rear of what you're towing. And that would be the same if you're towing it behind a pickup truck. And by the way, the second you're towing that behind a pickup truck, that means the truck is now a slow-moving vehicle. So you shouldn't travel faster than 40 kilometers an hour if you're towing anything that's got the SMV sign on it. And the other specifically one is road vehicles. Technically, slow-moving vehicles could be used on a horse. They could be used on a bicycle. Because they are also vehicles under the Highway Traffic Act. But for this case, we're talking about farm equipment. So it is also illegal for that to be on a fence post. I would kindly remind any of your neighbors, if you see that, that's a $107 fine if a policeman wants to write you up for it. The time they will write you up for it is when the person is in the ditch and says, I saw an SMV sign at the last minute, I swerved. You will get a ticket for now having an SMV sign. I don't think it's the best thing. Cut it in half so it's not an SMV sign, if you like it because of its retroreflectiveness. And by the way, there's lots of other reflectors you can buy that are retroreflective. But make it so it's not an SMV sign if you're putting it on your mailbox, as an example. What type of vehicles are required to have an SMV sign? I think I've covered this off. I'll do it quickly. Tractors, self-propelled implements of husbandry, must display it on the rear. If these machines are being towed and they're towing one or more implements, the sign has got to be on the back. Technically, it should be between 1 meter and 2 meters and as close to the center as possible. But somewhere on the back of that vehicle tends to be okay. Keeping it up higher so it doesn't get as muddy and as well in the view of a driver is good. Having it too high also takes it out of the view of persons. People tend to look straight ahead in a very small pinpointed view line. Any vehicle that, including but not limited to such things as construction equipment, street sweepers, that's one I always see on the 401 with SMV signs on the back. Technically, they're not supposed to be able to attain those speeds. They are being made with higher speeds. They cannot travel at higher than 40 kilometers an hour if the SMV sign is displayed. If you're towing one of them or you have them on a flatbed, for example, you should actually be covering the SMV sign, and it always needs to be displayed on the back of it. So that's just an important feature. We don't want to be sending other drivers the simple fact that you are not an SMV. They get used to it. They won't pay attention to it when we want them to. This is the question. A lot of people ask me this question. What about high-speed tractors? Those are tractors that are geared from manufacturers being able to do more than 40 kilometers an hour. The simple answer is, I can buy a Maserati. I can't drive it at higher than the speed limit on the road. It's the same thing with these tractors. The Act reads, no person will operate, and it's a shall, operate the slow-moving vehicle on the highway unless a slow-moving vehicle sign is attached. And by the way, a farm tractor is an SMV by definition, so you have to have an SMV sign on it. A farm tractor, self-propelled implements of husbandry are slow-moving vehicles. That's in the definition in the Highway Traffic Act. So although a fendant may come and be able to go to high speed, it is now in Canada, in Ontario, it is a farm tractor. Hence, it is a slow-moving vehicle. And if you remove that SMV sign, it doesn't matter. It's still a farm tractor, and a farm tractor is a slow-moving vehicle. So now you're guilty of removing the SMV sign and not having it posted, and you're guilty of speeding. So it's now 2 infractions, quite simply. So no person will operate a slow-moving vehicle at greater than 40 kilometers an hour. Simply put, I hear lots of speeding tickets being delivered to people with high-speed tractors, and people have argued, well, I have brakes on my trailers. It's got nothing to do with that. Farm equipment has the exemption that it is a slow-moving vehicle and has a bunch of other exemptions. The safety factor is because you're not traveling at 55 or 60 kilometers an hour. So that's how you get away with not doing a bunch of the other stuff you need to do. So my advice would be get your tractor, drive it the way you're meant to be, and don't try and fuss about your tractor being able to go 30% faster. And if you work that out over the 20 miles you need to go, it doesn't work out to that much time. It's going to work out to like 5 minutes in your day. And the other thing to note is an awful lot of farm equipment, the bearings and the tires are not rated at more than 40 kilometers an hour. So often what we hear about is someone going down the road doing more than the speed limit, but the bearing in the vehicle that they're pulling burns out and spins off, and they lose a tire or a hub. So the equipment's not meant to go at the higher speed. So take advantage of your SMV exemptions and use them appropriately is my advice. When the sign is prohibited on a slow-moving vehicle sign, it must be displayed, period. So if you're defined as a slow-moving vehicle sign, you must have it. And you're prohibited from displaying it if you are traveling over 40 kilometers, which some people have argued with the high-speed tractors, well, I'll just cover over the SMV sign. Doesn't work. It's defined as a farming tractor. So because it's a farming tractor, it is a slow-moving vehicle sign. So as I said, if you cover up the SMV, in that case, you're actually breaking the law twice, once speeding and once covering the sign. Tractors, if you put the tractors on floats, for example, or something like that, then I would cover up the SMV sign, and then you can travel. Then it is a load. It's not a piece of farm equipment. So you can do it and load it that way. Further to that, when towing implements such as a wagon, some people do some tillage equipment, headers on a wagon such as that, with a truck. If you put you should technically have an SMV sign on it because that equipment is part of the slow-moving vehicle, and hence you shouldn't be traveling over 40 kilometers an hour. It's just how that works by definition. That gets you around the lengths, gets you around the issues of braking, requirements of those things for weight. But the second you do it, even though the truck can definitely do more than 40, once you put that SMV sign in display, you become in a slow-moving vehicle. So keep that in mind when you're doing this. Again, that's that gray area people try to find. Perfectly good trying to find it. It's hard to defend it once you've had an accident and someone starts to investigate. So you can get away with it. You can get away with it for 10 years. The second that something breaks free and happens, do expect to pay a bit of retribution for what you've gotten away with. I'm saying that tongue in cheek, but I do know that some people are trying to do things. There are very specific regulations in Ontario. Specifically, they do rate around the width of the vehicles as much as the length. It's very hard in a quick presentation like this to tell people about it, but you do need, traveling at night, you will need to have some form of a clearance light as far out as possible. You'll need to have some way of signaling your braking and some way of signaling your turning signals. So that's sort of the minimum you'll need on the back end of equipment. You will need, obviously, headlights on the front. Technically, you don't need to have flashing amber lights, etc. Some people do that. Please make sure you're doing it within the rules of the road. The other one is, please don't use your field lights on the road. They are blinding to anyone coming towards you, and they won't see if a piece of tillage equipment is hanging out past your tires. So they'll miss your headlights, but they may not miss what you're towing. And the other thing is that people that do have flashers and beacons on and run them in the field, I suggest turning them off, because the trouble is people see it and they won't be aware of it when you want them to be aware of it. So, and the other thing is, often when people see four-way flashers going on in the field, etc., they often think the person's in trouble at night, and it leads to 911 calls. The 911 call comes, they send the fire department, EMS, usually the last person to get there is the police, and now you're embarrassed because you were driving in the field with your four-ways on. So I wouldn't have them on. Obviously, if you have an incident and you need to, that is one way to help signal people. I discuss that a lot more when I talk about working alone. Passengers, every year in Ontario, in just Ontario, about 2 people are killed from runovers, and that is passengers. Believe it or not, the number one person involved in a runover is the operator. Bypass starting, getting off to open gates, not putting parking locks on. But passengers fall off because farm equipment is not meant for passengers. And that includes the training seats. If you read your manual, they are only meant for training, and they do not protect in the case of a rollover, and because the person is usually too far off to the side, and they're not protected. And obviously in rollover, you're not protected if you don't have seatbelts on either. But the safest way to protect our passengers, and that would include riding on equipment or on the tongue or on the wheels. That's another way that people get run over. They fall off the ladder, etc. Is no riders specifically. They're not vehicles for passengers. And if you read your manual, that will be the quote that someone will use at you at some other point in time if they need to, is the manufacturers will not say use these things as passenger vehicles. ATVs, Laura, I was asked to talk quickly about ATVs. Again, this topic is relatively large. ATVs are, for definition for people, are the ones you steer like a motorcycle, and you straddle a gas tank usually. Most of these on the roads are not allowed to have passengers. A quick indicator for passengers is if they come equipped with double sets of foot pegs. The reason is that the passenger can't support themselves in a quick turn if they don't have their feet on a foot peg. And you shouldn't have the passenger if they can't put their feet on the foot peg. Highway Traffic Act is very specific, and it's had some regulation changes, but there's also the off-road vehicles, which includes the utility vehicle, the side-by-sides. The number one thing on the roads is you have to be over 16 and licensed. I'll go into this a bit more in the next slide. Under 16, you cannot even cross the road, which is different than, say, farm exemptions. Farm exemptions, you can cross the road. You need to be 16 to travel parallel with the road, but you don't need a license. So there are some differences there. And the other differences that come along, get the button in the right place. These vehicles are designed for off-road use. One of the reasons is when you're using them on the roadway, they tend to have softer tires, so they tend to bounce a lot, and it's easy to lose control. That's why there are speed limits to where you can use them. You need to pay attention to that. Maximum on the roads is 50 kilometers an hour with an ATV or a UTV. Off-road vehicles need special permission to be on the road. They are an off-road vehicle by their definition, so they shouldn't be on the road. If you're using them for farm, there are some other things that we need to pay attention to, but some of the other things that are in there is the idea of golf carts, which technically are not supposed to ever be used on the road. Road building machines, motorized wheelchairs, these things all end up with some other definitions in the off-road vehicle and those things. But for our sake, it's the ATVs, which are the straddle sitting ones, the utility vehicles, which are the side-by-sides, as a lot of people refer to them, or the gator type thing. Then there's the Argos, the off-road motorcycles, and the dune buggies. Obviously, some off-road motorcycles can be road licensed, so can some dune buggies. I don't know if Argos can be road licensed or not. These things do tend to get used around the farm. If you're using them for a farm, it needs to be a bit more specific into how you can use the equipment, how it's set up to use. And the second you're claiming it's a farm equipment, you need to put an SMV sign on the back of it, which means you're now limited at 40 kilometers an hour. So try and be aware of those things. Mandatory for, and I put farm in little letters on here, but if you're traveling on the roadways, the vehicle must be registered. You have to be insured with an auto policy on that piece of equipment. Main reason there is liability. The driver must be licensed, so hence they are also over the age of 16. Drivers and all passengers must wear helmets, and the driver and passengers have to wear seat belts if the vehicle is equipped. So, for example, all sport utility vehicles all have seat belts on them. You must be wearing a seat belt, or you can be ticketed for not. These rules all fall apart the second you go on private property. On private property, you don't need to wear a helmet. You don't need to wear your seatbelt. Technically, anybody can operate it. I always say make sure that the person is physically and mentally capable of doing it. Sometimes younger people tend to drive with reckless abandon, so that doesn't justify it. If they're under the age of 12, they need to be in parental supervision, which means line of sight. So they drive around the house, 3/4 of the time they're out of your line of sight. The same thing if they drive out and go around the barn or the drive shed and come back. The whole time they're out of your sight, they're no longer in your supervision. So just having some friends over, sitting in the backyard around a campfire and letting the kids drive away in the ATVs is not adult supervision. So that would get you into trouble if an incident ever does occur. And I advise, actually, if you've got visitors that don't know ATVs, take the keys out of them. What often happens is the inexperienced will try and do what the experienced is doing and get into trouble. So it's the kid who never drove the ATV before that tries to do something and will get into trouble, whereas the other person riding the vehicle will have tended to have had experience enough to know what their limits are. Obviously, incidents do occur. You don't have full control. But the last thing you want is some visitor to come over with their kid, and that kid gets hurt on your farm because you weren't supervising and watching over them properly. So my advice is pull the keys. It's just not the right time to do it unless you're going to spend the time and actually supervise and train. And then you need to be a certain weight to operate, especially ATVs. They require you to shift your weight and use your weight to steer them. So ATVs, you need to be of the right size and physical ability to run them. So I think that's actually the end of my slides for today. I've got some questions. COVID is a big issue, and I threw this one in there. We have an app. It's available on the App Store and the iStore for free. It's not a tracking tool. It's a resource tool. So if you're looking for stuff like how to hand wash, what to do, how to do a pre-screening on your farm, what should I do with visitors coming to my farm, I would suggest going to the app stores. You can download it. It's called Prevent COVID at Work, and it's free. And as I say, it's not a tracking device. It will get you what you need. So I think that's it. I'll slip to one more slide because it's got our phone number and etc. on there. I left mine on there. A couple of the other guys probably phone me. We do have a duty consultant on call during normal working hours, 5 days a week. And obviously our website is in the bottom corner. I would add /farm safety to that. If you're going for COVID, type in /COVID. And we have a very specific site just for those. So Laura, I'm going to finish there. I think I used my time. And I probably have used up my voice almost, but
you were saying that you were doing many of these webinars, Dean, and so we truly appreciate you taking the time out of your day to help us with ours, because it is so important to get this message across to farmers. This is a great time of the year to be speaking to them. It'll be top of mind as they're going into spring season, and we just really appreciate it. And I know I'm the same, talking all day on webinars. You get, oh my goodness, my throat's a little sore now.
Well, so, and I'm getting used to it, so I think.
Yeah, you get used to it.
This is a fun one. I've been doing COVID recently, and I've got still, I think, 5 more with the ministry that I'm doing, but I get one on Thursday night I'm doing on working alone. So I do get some fun topics every once in a while. Fun by different.
Sure. Yes. And actually, when you said that working alone that you were talking on that, I thought, oh, that might be a good one for us to follow up with you in the future months.
We actually have just designed a new webinar for that, and we actually have some little videos for it too.
Wonderful. I have a couple questions for you, Dean, just from this webinar that you've just talked about. So talking about safety chains and making sure that they're strong enough for what you're pulling behind, if you've got 3 gravity wagons or whatever, is there an easy spot that farmers can go to reference to find the weight restrictions for this chain that has a length of 3 inches or whatever? Like, is there something that they can go and say, yes, this chain will pull X amount of tons of corn down the road? Or
chains that are meant for pulling or a weight will be stamped in some manner and usually it's a static weight, which means you could hang the wagon from that chain. Obviously there's a little bit more to it if you're all of a sudden pulling it and jerking it, that kind of thing. I would say if you're in doubt, I would go to someone who sells chain regularly, maybe not just Canadian Tire, but go to your dealer and tell them what you're doing, and they can help you. And you can calculate your weight relatively quickly. The weight of the wagons, the weight of the grain approximately. So you can figure it out pretty quick. And then making sure, and you will be surprised how fast that chain has to grow in size by the weight that's being added to it. So, but again, it's not just they may come with a chain on them, but it'll be designed just for that grain buggy. And the second you add a grain buggy behind, the chain on the behind buggy will probably be okay. It's the chain on the front buggy. And that's where you also end up with issues with your draw pins. And draw pins are stamped also for their weight.
This is great to know. Thank you. And then one other question, also talking about lighting. Some older equipment that you might be operating with may not have connections for brake lights or turn signals, and that's required going down the road, you were saying. So what is a way that a farmer could make their equipment more, or what's available for them to make that equipment applicable?
There's two ways you could probably do that, or probably three, but I'll go to two. The first one would be if you're operating it during the day, you can use hand signals. So with the older equipment, generally it's not as big to pull the big stuff. There's no problem using bicycle hand signals. They're still if you go train for highway traffic for driving, for your license, they will teach you the standard hand signals. No problem. And that's what people do with horses and buggies. And it's perfectly legal to do that. The other thing you can do is you could retrofit, and it would be a hookup that would just be a setup where you hook directly to your battery within a switch. But it's at nighttime is the problem when you need the turn signals. So don't operate at night would be one solution. The other one would be to retrofit it and put on lights, but making sure the colors are right. I don't advise, I've heard of people, I got a white strobe light I put on, and I got the colors of strobe lights and things like that are purposefully designed in the Highway Traffic Act. For example, the blue flashing light for snow removal, the green lights for volunteer firefighters down the road. The police lights are the same way. So make sure you're not just buying what's nice and available at Princess Auto. And if you do go to ELAW's Highway Traffic Act, you can go to the section and it'll tell you exactly what you need to have. Or contact the Ministry of Transportation. Their people are very good at that too. There actually is a book you can download off the website. I think it's current. It looks like this. Okay. And it's actually called the Farm Guide to Farm Equipment on the Highway. It is a Ministry of Transportation document, and you can go into that if you need to be specific about it. So you can retrofit your equipment. You can buy the magnetic lights like tow truck drivers put on equipment, and do that, put it on, and then the only thing is needing to operate a turn signal type thing with it, and technically you could attach that. Newer equipment all has 7-pin attachments and that kind of stuff, so you need to retrofit the towed piece of equipment, but it matches the tractor.
That's great. Thank you so much. This has been really informative. I knew some of these things, but I also have learned some things from your talk, and I'm sure many farmers will be in the same boat. So thank you so much, Dean, for your time, and we truly appreciate it.
But I appreciate the opportunity, and obviously if anyone sends you questions, you can forward them to me. That's Definitely. No problem. My email address is probably the best way to get me, and just say, from your talk with grain farmers, I saw this, I had a question. And if I don't know the answer, I will go to someone who can tell me.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Not a problem.